Bienvenidos. This is a podcast that explores Latinx media and culture in its many forms. I am Dr. Rojo Robles.
And I am Dr. Rebecca L. Salois. And we are Latinx and Latin American Studies professors at Baruch College in New York City. In this podcast, we will analyze Latinx film, television, literature, art, and cultures.
We will consider how these works are perceived, analyze them, and investigate the real-world reflections and implication of that work on Latinx cultures in the U.S. and beyond.
Welcome to Latinx Visions.
Bienvenidas, bienvenidos, bienvenides.
Welcome back, everyone. Today we begin our sixth season of Latinx Visions. Can you believe that? We've been doing this for 3 years.
3 años, wow.
Yeah, I love it. It's fantastic. You know, this semester we are looking at yet another theme, and we are considering Latinx climate activism. And we're speaking with different individuals and organizations about the connections between culture, community, and climate. We're speaking with writers, creators, and activists on how they engage with and bring attention to the climate crisis.
As we designed this season, Rebecca and I talked about how engaging in discussions about the climate crisis is crucial for Latina communities, as they are affected by its impact in a deep way. Latinx people often reside in areas with higher environmental vulnerabilities, facing increased exposure to pollution, extreme weather events, and rising temperaturas, right? Additionally, many Latinos, Latinas work in industries affected by the climate crisis, such as agriculture, among others.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
With our guests, we will be addressing these disparities and thinking together on how to foster awareness, advocacy, and collective action. As with our recent seasons, we will release episodes in English and Espanol.
Today, we're going to be sharing a conversation we had with Afro-Latino writer and podcaster Anthony Otero. The interview took place on Friday, February 2nd, 2024. Otero joined us at Baruch for an in-person conversation about his short-form comic publications and how they connect to the concept of climate activism. So first, before that, we'll give a little bit of background on Otero, and then we'll dive into the interview itself. After the interview is concluded, we'll be back to share our thoughts and key takeaways from the conversation.
Once again, thank you for joining us for our Latinx Climate Activism season, la sexta temporada of the podcast. Enjoy.
Anthony Otero is a Bronx native and a Syracuse University alum. He is a self-identified Afro-Latino blogger and podcaster who has previously contributed to the Huffington Post. He began his blogging career in 2009, chronicling his life on the journey towards self-publishing. He currently serves as the director for meetings and events at Rutgers University, New Brunswick.
Otero aspired to be a published author for most of his life, and he achieved this with his first book, Hanging Upside Down, released in 2014. This is a novel that explores the pressures men face after divorce, the consequences of letting good intention go astray, and how a single turn of events can change the world as they know it. Otero followed his book with The Book of Isabel, released in 2016, which explored questions about friendships and lost love.
Today, we'll be talking to Anthony about some of his short-form works, in particular 2 comics he wrote for different Latinx comic anthologies. The first work published was La Casita of American Heroes, which was featured in the Eisner-winning comic book anthology Puerto Rico Strong. All proceeds from the sale of this anthology went to the people affected by Hurricane Maria.
His second contribution to the world of comics came in 2021 with a digital reward for Kickstarter backers of Mañana, Latinx comics from the 25th century, set throughout Latin America in the year 2490.
Yeah, right? 500 years from 1,000 years from the quote-unquote discovery, at least by Europeans, of the Americas.
So Mañana presents readers with a radical array of futures, ranging from post-apocalypse to liberationist utopias, and even includes magical realism.
Yes, I was one of those Kickstarter backers, so I was very excited when I saw word of that comic coming out. Beyond writing, Otero is one of 5 co-hosts in the Black Comics Chat, a podcast on the intersection of comics and Blackness. And as he'll mention in the podcast, they primarily stream on Twitch these days. Otero and Marcus Kwame, Leonardo Fairman, Grace Gibson, and Thelonious Legend all chat with comic creators and promote diverse comics in this podcast. So now we're just going to go ahead and lead us into the interview.
Enjoy.
All right, everyone. Welcome back. We have today with us a special guest. We have Anthony Otero here. We are excited to talk to you about comics and also climate crisis. So that's an interesting combination we've got for you.
Okay.
But we figured we'd start out with talking about your experiences in comics. What have they been both as a reader and a writer of comics?
That's a fair question and a good question. So I've been collecting comic books since, I'm gonna have to date myself, since I was a kid. So I want to say probably in the 80s, even though I think my oldest comic book is probably from 1978. But I actually remember buying them, or at least my mother buying them, as early as 82. I collected a lot of DC when I was a kid. And then as I got into high school, I started collecting a lot of Marvel. DC kind of didn't do it for me anymore. And just to give, if you're really into comic books, to give the timeline, I was really into DC around Crisis on Infinite Earths, which came out in about 85, 86.
Okay.
I collected Firestorm, Flash, Green Lantern, Justice League. But I guess as I got older, I got more into the X-Men and Spider-Man. So when I was in high school and I actually had a job, I would actually go to the comic book store and buy comics myself, and those tended to be more Marvel. Got it.
Yeah.
In college, I kind of fell off because I didn't have money to do that.
Relatable.
And I would say I started collecting again probably around 9/11, to be quite honest. It's when I started really, I came back to New York. I used to work and live in Syracuse before I did anything professionally. And I moved back, worked in Wall Street. I was there for 9/11. And it's interesting because I remember that day I wanted to go to the comic book store. And I was set on doing that because there was a Ultimate Spider-Man comic book coming out that day, or at least it came out the day before. I wasn't sure. And I was set on going there, and I never did, obviously, because things happened. But yeah, comic books have been a part of my life. And even as a kid, I would always dream about writing a comic book. Like I have I have one of those old notebooks. I forgot what they're called, like those composite notebooks.
Oh, the black and white marble ones.
Yes, the black and white, the marble notebooks. And I've got like a list of characters and stories and stuff like that. If I read them now, they'd probably be either illegible or copyright infringement somewhere. But yeah, I was very much into it, and that got me into role playing and thinking about writing. I was an English major in college. I went to Syracuse, so everything kind of connects for me.
Sure.
And life is what it is. I stopped collecting as much as I used to, but I do collect on and off. I certainly collect more now that everything is digital. It's just great. I don't have to.
I can't do the digital still. I just can't.
Yeah.
And so what about writing them?
Writing them? So first I had a blog because I felt like I just needed to be able to write, because I write to just write and just get my thoughts on paper. I never really thought that I would actually write anything substantial. And then I think what really happened was moving back to Syracuse and working there as a student affairs professional. I ended up meeting, and I said this earlier in the green room, was I met Junot Diaz. Mm-hmm. And at that point I was like, I think about writing a book. And when I met him and I realized, you know what, I can do this. Because he seems like a normal person, just writing about whatever moves him. I went ahead and wrote a novel. I wrote 2 novels. I wrote one in 2014. Actually, it's going to be 10 years, yes. And then one in 2016, just because I felt like I needed something to say. Mm-hmm. And then part of in doing that process, I was interviewed by a few podcasts. One having to deal with Black creators called Black Comics Chat, and I became friends with them. And then I ended up being one of their co-hosts, which I still am today.
Yes.
And through them, I was able to meet Black and Latino artists and writers, people in the comic book industry, folks I never thought I would get to meet. We've had great interviews, and at that point, Hurricane Maria had hit.
Yes.
And we all, and for those who don't know, I am Puerto Rican Ecuadorian. So most of us, when this hit, it was terrible. You know, there was a lot of terrible things. There was the toilet paper incident. There was toilet paper or paper towel incident.
Yeah.
You know, and I think in general, when you have family down there, you feel powerless. You don't know what to do. So I ended up getting an email, or I think maybe a Twitter message, when it was Twitter, from Desiree, who was one of the folks at Lion Forge. And I knew Desiree because I had met her through the podcast. And she was like, I know that you write. I was wondering if you'd be interested in writing a comic or writing a story in a comic book called Puerto Rico Strong. But I need you to pitch me. And I need you to do that in the next 24 hours. So I was like, wow. I've never had to pitch a comic book.
Right. Your novels are self-published,
yes,
correct?
They're self-published. Yeah. But comic books are different because it's a script. So I had to buy some books, do some quick reading, and then I pitched this really short blurb about a mother and her child going to the island looking for her parents. And I had to I had to write this, I think, in 8 pages or something like that. So I was like, I think I can do this. She accepted the pitch, and I had to then write the script very soon, very quickly, because everything was moving so fast. And she had asked me, or she said, I hope you had an artist. And I'm like, oh my God, I don't even have an artist. Or at least I thought I didn't. But going back to my novel, one of the things that I was really toying with for the cover of the first book, called Hanging Upside Down, was just some sort of drawing that had to do with the story. But it didn't come out right after contacting the artist, because it seemed like I was trying to sell a graphic novel when I'm like, no, it's just a novel. So I went with a completely sort of black matted cover. But I kept in contact with that artist. His name is Oogie. And he was the first person I thought about. You know, and I met him like, again, in about 2014. So here we are. 2016? I think that's when the hurricane happened.
17.
17? Yeah. 2017. And I contacted him, and I was like, so we really couldn't work together. I ended up paying him for his work, but I was like, how about doing a comic book? I was like, but we probably won't get paid because it is sort of pro bono. So he of course he was down. I was like, okay, cool. So I had to write the script, send him the stuff, and I don't know. I'm hoping you read it.
Oh yeah,
saw it.
We got some questions for you.
Amazing. To me, he's an amazing artist, and him and I worked very well. And what made me laugh was I was too wordy in the dialogue. I had to cut down some of the words. But for that story, it was La Casita of American Heroes. I used some of my own background. In terms of the history of my family in the armed forces.
Okay.
And I always wanted to make a commentary about, at that time, how Puerto Ricans are not viewed as citizens, even though we've been in the most of every major war in terms of military service. So that was the point of that whole thing. But from there, I mean, that went well. I cried when we won the award. Because I'm like, I can't believe that I'm actually a part of that. And then Mañana came out, or at least pitches for Mañana came out. And I know that publisher very well because we do a lot of interviews with her.
Sure.
And she had gotten so many pitches. She had gotten pitches from me, some of my co-hosts, and she had to really sort of scale it down.
It's a large book to begin with.
She had to scale it down. And she apologized. She apologized to me for not making the book, but she said, I'll make you a digital reward. But I still need you to create something. So this time, not that I didn't want to use Oogie, but I wanted to use somebody else. I wanted to use a woman artist. a Black woman artist in particular because of the characterizations in the story. And I was able to connect with, I always forget her first name, but I know her last name is Sanders. And her Instagram, I usually just know, I think it's NY Sanders.
Okay.
And I saw her work and I was like, this is beautiful. This is exactly what I want. And this time we were getting paid for it. So we were able to sort of split the money that we were given down evenly and sort of come up with this 10-page story, which was actually a lot harder for me to write in concept. And I'm sure we'll get into that. But those are the two things that I've written that were published. I do have other scripts that I haven't published.
Okay.
Things that I'm still working on, wrapping my head through, that maybe one day will see the light of day.
But being a part of that community now, you might have more opportunities to make that happen.
It's not, yes, I absolutely. I think that I have I have some artists in mind.
So, you talked about specifically connecting with Black and Latinx creators, comic writers, and artists. So what value do you see in the visual storytelling medium in particular, especially when it comes to stories about Black and Latinx experiences?
To me, it's very important to have the representation in comic books, because I think that even in 2024, representation is lacking. I think if you really want the representation you're looking for, you're often looking at self-published work, or you're looking at independent work, which is absolutely fine and completely legitimate and valid. And through those, I think is where we really tell our story. I'm not sure who said this, but I think there's a quote somewhere that if you wanted to hide something of value, you put it in a book, and I think for us, being able to visually show whether it's our fantasy, which or our nightmare, or anything that we're trying to display, is very powerful, especially in the hands of children or in the hands of young adults who don't see themselves in the medium.
Yeah.
By the way, Anthony, how do you see comics and comics podcasting, serving as a tool precisely for reaching the communities you're part of? Especially thinking about like the global issues that are affecting these communities, and the interrelationship of these like social issues, and specifically maybe we can get into the climate crisis, but others as well.
I consider what we do in podcasting and what we do in comic books is political. Everything is political because our identities are political. Our identities are used as pawns in any crisis or anything. I mean, here in New York City, you have our mayor really using the migrant situation as a backdrop for whatever agenda he has, which is unfortunate. But at least in the podcast that I have, we talk about all of that, because it's important, because just because you're considered to be a nerd doesn't mean that you don't understand or don't have a cause that's important to you that may not be within the nerddom. But also, I think reflecting that back in our work is important. And I think that's what I try to do in any of the things that I write, is to kind of reflect what's happening or what has happened in the work, because if not, it's just fluff. I mean, just to go back, even think about it now, when you think about Star Trek, you think about Lord of the Rings, you think about all that stuff, there's a lot of political statements in those. And I think that's important, particularly for sci-fi and for anything that has to do with comic books.
Yeah. I mean, I did with my class last semester, which was a Latinx comics course. We did some stuff with like America Chavez and Miles Morales and all of that. And I think the students were like pleasantly surprised to find how much depth there was within those comics, especially those who weren't familiar with the medium. I was looking through at some of your blog writing that you had done, and there was a blog post you had in like the early days of the pandemic. And I think this line is going to really like pull us into that climate bit. You wrote, "I'm not an environmentalist in any way, so I won't get into climate change, even though I believe in the science." And, we want to ask you about climate change, not so much from an environmentalist perspective, because as you said, you're not one, but from the perspective of an Afro-Latino and the perspective of a writer. What do you see as the impacts of the climate crisis on everyday Puerto Ricans living on the island or Latinos and Latin Americans around the world?
First, it's funny you asked that because I was thinking about this last night in terms of Third World, the story that I wrote for Mañana, because part of that story in thinking about what would Puerto Rico, or at least what the world would look like 500 years from now. And I think a lot of that, and a lot of what I wrote is because of the effects of climate change. The waters are rising, which means that who knows what anything will look like in 500 years. Will the island still be there? I don't know. But I think hurricanes are becoming worse. Snowstorms are everything's becoming worse. And I think that affects us because I'm trying to think how best way to say this. When you're a population that's mostly been colonized, you don't really have a lot to call your own. Yes, we can say that Puerto Rico is, for Puerto Ricans, but it's still a colonized land of the United States. When you begin to start losing your identity on the outset, and then the world is changing and you start losing your island, that is going to have a traumatic effect on the population. And that's not just Puerto Rico. That could be the Dominican Republic, Cuba, any part of the Caribbean islands, South America, any of the places that are coastal. Those things are going to be an issue. And I think the problem really is that when a hurricane goes through the Caribbean, we look at it from an American side, well, okay, that's a storm, but those people live those things, and that is an every year occurrence. At some point, you have to think about the trauma that produces. Mm-hmm. We love to talk about tornadoes and how they rip through the Midwest, and the trauma that those folks have of having to rebuild every year or close to. We don't really hear about the trauma that happens in the Caribbean, or at least I don't. But again, living in the Northeast, maybe you hear it if you're living in Florida or in your Caribbean, you'll know that. But I think it's going to be a tough time for folks who look like me or folks who live in the Caribbean who are dealing with this, because it is real, regardless of whether you believe in the science or not. It's real, and I think it's going to affect us in numerous ways. And my final point is, with things happening like that and the destructive nature of global warming and climate change, a lot of history gets lost. You know what I mean? Yeah, I know that, and then I'm going to Puerto Rico in June, but I know that when I go down to any Caribbean island, I try to go to museums, try to look at sort of what stop of this I know it's kind of supposed to be a vacation, but what kind of stop on this particular place where the transatlantic slave trade was. I know that's like, why would you do that on vacations? Because I still want to learn, because I think it's still important. Those type of things could get wiped away if they're a major category 5 hurricane hits.
Yeah.
You were mentioning your comic in Puerto Rico Strong, like a city of American heroes before, and we would like to expand a little bit on that discussion.
Sure.
Right? As you mentioned, this comic is centered around Puerto Ricans in the U.S. military. Mm-hmm. You frame it, of course, in the backdrop of the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, because the book, the collection is on that precisely. But within the story, that is kind of like the backdrop as well. Yeah. And also it works, as a claim, and this is something that you mentioned before, Puerto Ricans belonging to the U.S. Due to that history in the U.S. military. So what inspired you to focus? You mentioned that it was like something very quick, but what inspired you to focus on this storyline? And this is another part of the question that it will be great to engage with you. How do you navigate discussions with Puerto Ricans who reject the U.S. empire politically and critically and disagree with these assertions of belonging?
I'm gonna answer the easy one first, which is the story. What inspired me about the story is my grandfather. Now, my grandfather was a merchant marine, so he didn't serve in the war, but his brother, I guess that would consider my great uncle, did. I was told a story of my uncle Carlos and how I'm trying to see if I can get this correct. He fought in World War II and he died in France. So he has a gravestone in France. one of the stories that I was told was because he was dark-skinned, he fought with the Black Regiment. Okay. And he was guarding again, this is a story that I heard. He was guarding a Nazi officer who was in prison or in the brig or something where they were holding prisoners. And the fact that he was guarding that officer incensed the officer. He would, racial slurs, and he actually complained so much that they had to move him as in my uncle, and have somebody else guard him. Because for some reason, I guess the complaints of a Nazi officer was more important than who was guarding him. And I found that to be very powerful, because even in France, you're dealing with American racism, and you're also Puerto Rican, which, depending on who you speak to, many of the folks don't understand how American racism works, or at least particularly back then. So in thinking about that, I thought about all the other folks, and I did some research on the history of the military or military service in Puerto Rico, and how that can stretch in a family legacy, from, the Spanish-American War on. World War I, World War II, Vietnam, the Korean War, Desert Storm, Operation Desert Storm, all that stuff, even until now, because a lot of folks feel that the military is a good way for them to earn money, get an education. So in that particular story, I made sure that I highlighted particularly that the main character came from a lineage of folks who probably served and died in the war, just as she was a part of that, and the importance of that, because it's still important.
It becomes also a genealogy of war.
Yeah,
as well.
Absolutely.
Seen through a family history, family history.
Right. So, I think that my relationship with, I think, Puerto Ricans on the island is not something that I can speak to like offhand. I don't speak to a lot of them because most of my family live here. I do have some family there, but I think from folks that I have spoken to, it is very much a contentious thing. Yeah, the identity of Puerto Rico, like where does it land? Should it be a state? Should it be independent? And I think depending on who you ask, you're going to get a very visceral response. My mother will say, well, I think it should be a state. I'm like, well, it's because you're American. It's that's an answer I come to understand from her, and I understand why she would say that. But if you live on the island, your thought is, here you are, there, Vieques was a thing. You were bombing, you were doing, and you're causing ecological damage to the island. You have industry down there that's focused on tourism, but not necessarily focused on the folks who live there. And to really understand this, I would always recommend, for those who haven't read, the War on Puerto Ricans. It's a book written, I forgot the name of the author. It's called The War on Puerto Ricans.
It's a journalist. I think it's his name is Dennis.
Yes.
I forgot now his last name, but Dennis.
Great book on the history of Puerto Rico that really talks about what it was like when the United States took over from Spain, and the sugar industry, and how that has reshaped what the island looks like, and the money that has gone directly from the island to America. He talks about domino sugar. He talks all about it's a really good book. But that's a good understanding of where Puerto Rico is in terms of not only the industry, but in terms of its identity. I think that it's hard to really surmise what the final answer should be, because I think it depending on who you ask, the answer is going to be different. My family who lives in America, and I just want to say that, will always be concerned if Puerto Rico, let's say, were to break away. What does that mean economically? You know, does that become a third world island or stuff like that? And people want to still keep that connection and still be called a United States citizen, even though they have no voting power. It's just very interesting. And I think I try not to get into too many debates because I think people feel very visceral about it, and they have every right to be. And I'm just here in America writing about them, you know.
Yeah, something that you mentioned that we also wanted to touch upon is how also talking about the military in the context of Puerto Rico give us another perspective, right? The impact of the military on the archipelago.
Yeah.
Right? If we focus on that impact on the ecological devastation caused by the U.S. in Vieques, you mentioned Vieques, but not only in Vieques, right? In other parts of the archipelago, but notably in Vieques,
right?
Who still got the highest rate of cancer based on that history. Is this that other avenue to talk about the military? Is that something that you have explored, that you maybe have a plan to explore in the future?
That's not out of the realm of possibility. It's not. I think in that time frame, I wasn't trying to glorify military experience or glorify the military in Puerto Rico. I think my statement was the fact that at that time is really pointing out that people can say that Puerto Ricans are not really American citizens, but yet they die for this country, you know, which I think is important. But with that being said, I think there is a story there to talk about what has come from a lot of the military experimentation and the cost of that.
Yeah,
now that could be a comic book, you know,
Yeah.
that could be like, and I don't know if this is explored at all in La Boriqueña. I don't know if he goes into that too much.
Not
I
that
wouldn't
much
be surprised.
into
Right.
the history of the military or
But
But the ecological aspect,
ecological
he
aspect.
he focuses on that.
Yeah, and diaspora
Right.
and native myth. Yeah, it's more on that.
I've only read
right?
the first two
Right.
collections so far. So.
I mean, my thought is that, you know, you really have to figure out how you want to frame that. You know, because you can frame it in many ways. You can make it a horror story, or you could make it I got my powers because the U.S. military, you know, experimented. And I guess it really just depends on how you want to do it. If it was me, and if I really thought about it, I'd probably lean toward more horror. Because I think that's just the reality of it.
It's
but that's
closer to reality.
It's closer to reality. But I also think that would require a lot of research, you know, in terms of, you know, now that we're quote unquote done with Vieques, what does that mean? What's happening now? You know, and how are people? Yes, people are dying of cancer, but what else is happening? Because I think if you also look back at the history, we could also talk about the way they've treated women and the way that they have, you know, they've done experiments on women as well. And what does that look like? You know,
Yeah, that's like a horror sci-fi.
It's a horror
comic
sci-fi
type thing.
type
Like if you
of-
were to turn that into a fictionalized account, for sure, I can see that genre working for something. Kind of like side note to like the Low Woods, where she's talking a lot about like the digging. The mining and the effects of that on the citizens, right? What are the effects of the treatment of women, of the military, like experiments and all of that on Puerto
And
Ricans?
it's part of the U.S. machinery, of those decades. Yeah,
Absolutely.
the involvement in the world wars.
Yep.
In Korea, my grandfather went to Korea. And Vietnam, right? But also, like at the same time, there's a population control policy that is allowing this experiment to happen, right? So we see like the destruction of the imperial drive, that can, and indeed, I feel like it could be like a really interesting
and it's
aspect to exploring comics, through the horror genre, and in many other ways.
And if
the
you think
arts.
about, if you really think about it, and I'm going really deep here, when you look at stuff like Star Wars, you know, and they talk about the Empire, you talk about what the Empire has done. We'll use the example of Andor. you know, the things that he has seen the empire do. That's kind of real. You know what I mean? I think about in terms of prison labor. You know what I mean? You have these prisoners building parts for the Death Star. You know what I mean? Like that, you could easily look at the prison population here and what they build.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You could easily look at that. You can look at some of the experimentations. I think if Bad Batch is another Star Wars thing. I watch everything Star Wars, but they talk about the beginnings of the Empire and the experiments they're doing to people. That's all real. You know what I mean? In some way, that's not something that somebody just made up. That's actually happened. Even though it's
Just
fantasy.
reframed in
it's
space.
just reframed in exactly, and that's why it works. And people always love the rebellion, even though in real life the rebellion is something else. I'm not going to get into, but it
The
goes
rebellion usually gets demonized,
Right,
right?
the rebellions get-
in mainstream
in
media,
mainstream
right?
media, right.
But in Star Wars, it's celebrated.
It's celebrated.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just interesting if you look at the perspective of Star Wars from the other side. If you were in the Empire, and if sometimes really good writers will frame someone who's in the Empire and say, "Well, you're a terrorist." You know, so I'm again, everything Star Wars. I'm literally playing a Jedi a game right now on PlayStation called Jedi Survivor, and one of the things that the character will run into is people in the Empire calling him a terrorist. You know what I mean? And I'm like, that's interesting. I think in all the years I've watched Star Wars, played Star Wars, you don't really hear that T word, but until now. So it had a profound impact if you really are into that. But it's just interesting. So going back to the sort of the military complex and how that affects Puerto Rico, I think that there's so much rich history and probably a lot of material that can be used to explore. It just really depends on how you want to explore it.
So speaking of, space and all of that bit, let's transition over to the third world comic, because you talk about like terrorism and that sort of thing there. So in this comic you engage with Black speculative storytelling, and we wonder, like, how has this rich cultural movement influenced you, and why did you choose to center your narrative around an Afro-Puerto Rican character, even in a transnational story of societal collapse? Like,
Because you don't see that. you don't really see that. So I think I love stories, video games, characters where the main character is not a traditional character that we're used to seeing. Because I think that there is so much more. Not to say that there, like when you think about The Last of Us, Joel in the video game is white, but yet he's not. I believe he's not in the HBO series. It changes the dynamic of how you see the character. I mean, let's just be real about that. And I think, first of all, one of the things that I've always been consistent about in writing stories, because even the ones that I have not published, I always wanted to center the character. I always wanted to center the story around a woman, because we see a lot of guys, and I think that gets a little bit old, to be honest with you. So, and then center it around a woman of color. Is also important, because again, storytelling is not something that we normally see. So for this particular story, and I realized after writing it that there's so many layers, but I wanted to. So the character's name is Clara, or Clarita, and I kind of wanted to dedicate that to my late aunt. That was her name. And she was as dark as I am. And I wanted to create a strong character that was no nonsense, as she was, but put her in a situation in which she had a chance to save the world. I don't know how many stories you may have read about a woman of color saving the world, but there are not many out there. So the influence of Black speculative, it's been very influential to me, because it's something that I enjoy reading. I enjoy looking at, if especially with some of these folks who are such terrific artists, it really sort of sparks the imagination. And what I wanted to do was create a world and a story within that world that after you're done, you have so many more questions than you came in with, because who knows, maybe I'll expand it at some point. But I also recognize that there are a lot of themes that are sort of familiar You know, it's like, is this The Matrix? Is this Ready Player One? What is this? But I wanted to show that we're still around 500 years from now. I wanted to show that we still have love
As
of culture
Puerto Ricans.
as Puerto Ricans, that we're still here.
As Black Puerto Ricans.
As Black Puerto, exactly.
Yep.
And I think that that's important. Because when you look at futuristic stuff, really the question is, who do you think is still going to be around? We don't know, but I can tell you that at the end of the day, as the population increases, most of the population are going to be people of color.
Can you unpack? We're still with Third World, but let's get into the title. Yeah, let's unpack the title a little bit. Yeah, how is the concept of the Third World intertwined with corporate neocolonialism within the story that you created?
Well, first, I will tell you that I thought a lot about working class folks. You know what I mean? And the way it goes is that corporate America kind of have left Earth and have colonized Mars, leaving most of the working class on a different planet, but provided an opportunity to work on projects in Mars through this, I guess, through this matrix type of thing. This, because I would view the internet to be so much more than it is now. I would view that people could actually be in physical form, even though sort of like super work from home, you know, still be on Earth, but can plug in to go in this third world thing where they still have to work. They still have things to do. They still can get paid. They still do 9 to 5, but it's this whole working thing. And then within that structure, you still have, you know, you still have sort of like an entertainment industry. You still have music, and you still have some sort of artistry where you want to be big, not just on Earth, but you want to be big on Mars and third world. So it's this whole thing that we kind of see now, where it is people want to be big on the internet. People want to be social media stars, but just expand that to planetary level. And there is a corporation in the story that I don't really get into, but that corporation pretty much owns everything. There is a line that I like in Fight Club where the main character says that at the end of the day, it's going to be corporations that'll be naming stars and galaxies. You know what I mean? Because I believe that to be true. At some point, corporate America or the corporate world will start naming things that are not on this planet as if they own them. So
the new space race is led by Elon Musk right now.
But I was also thinking about, there is like a thing where you can name a star, and someone is making a profit off of that right now. Like, I mean, it's not like, why, like if I name a star after myself, the whole world isn't going to refer to that star by that, but that concept exists.
That concept exists. Absolutely. So yeah, and I think for me, I think there's also a hidden message within the story, is that I think personally I live in 3 worlds. You know, I live my, you know, Latino side, my Black side, and then it's somewhere in the middle is the third world that I have to function in, which is tied to work. You know what I mean? And I was thinking about that, and I was like, that's interesting how that all kind of just played out in my head. Because that was a very difficult story for me to write. Because I had to really world build, and I had to really think about
but not
concepts.
Like actually show us the world,
but not actually show you the world, just show you a glimpse
exists.
of it. And this is where, you know, the artist, she also kind of just laid out what she felt the world would look like. You know, and I specifically wanted it in black and white. I didn't want it to be colored because I wanted people to use a little bit more of their imagination. I also think there's something to be said about Black characters in black and white. And I wanted her to specifically have the dreadlocks. You know, I wanted specifically to have Black features because I felt that was important as well. And whoever, what better person to do that than a Black artist, a woman of color.
Third World highlights the use of Puerto Rico as a testing ground, as we were like talking about before. But it's interesting because you also like bring about topic of debt economies. So Third World is also a place to generate debt. And of course, like something very important in terms of ecological discussion is the creation of genetically modified food. Right? Could you elaborate on the interconnectedness of these practices and the resulting health and ecological costs that this story has imposed on Puerto Ricans, on Latinos, Afro-Latinos.
Right. Well, as we said before, I think Puerto Rico in particular has been used to test bombs and been test, women and fertility. At the end of the day, when the rich decide to move or the rich decide to do whatever they want, they have to test certain things. I mean, as it is now, I think they've cloned sheep. I think
that was a thing at one point. Do they still do that? What are they doing that with? I don't know, but I'm assuming at some point we're going to run out of food. With the way the world is changing, and the only thing I can think of is thinking about Star Trek and how they have these replicators, and they can just tell the computer to make this, and molecularly speaking, they do that. I don't see that being too far from what we could probably do now. 3D printing food.
3D printing food. Right. So I can.
You were talking about the history of plantations in Puerto Rico before, and right now, if we locate the plantation in Puerto Rico, it's a Monsanto plantation. So it's close to reality. Exactly. It's not something from the future.
I totally forgot about Monsanto. You are absolutely
but
correct.
That is part of the ecological debates, that people are engaging, and the activism in the island, the ecological activism is fighting, against that dominance, that corporate dominance.
And if you look at it now, there's always a report that says, well, this food is cancer causing because it has this particular ingredient. Where did this particular ingredient come from? Who said it was okay to put it in the food? And I almost feel like we're being tested now when it comes to the way we add preservatives to food and like corn syrup and stuff like that. Those things are terrible for your body, but it's everywhere, and you have to be very careful what you eat. And that's why I think the resulting effects of cancer, prostate cancer for men, breast cancer for women, all this stuff happens because we're ingesting things we should probably not be ingesting. We're in higher temperatures than we really need to be in, and just pollution in general. Mm-hmm. What happened to the ozone layer? Is there still a hole in there? There are things that I remember as a kid that I don't remember if they were solved. We've just moved on to the next thing, and then
the waters are rising,
and the waters are rising. So at the same time, it's like, what's happening?
Everything is connected.
So when in thinking about this story, I tried to think about everything that's happening now, but at a larger scale. If the ozone layer is going to disappear, when will that be? If we needed food and the food ran out and the people who could create that food moved, what's going to happen? Who's going to test it? Who are we testing it on? All this stuff plays into the fact that people of color end up being at the front line of a lot of that stuff, whether it be the military, whether it be testing food, whether it be any of that stuff. Mm-hmm. Because as we know, the rich just get richer. And they come up with these things now, we're going to start flying to the moon because we can, and not really using that money to solve world problems. Mm-hmm. And that's the point of third world. Instead of using the money to fix the world, they'd rather just go somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier when you talked about centering Afro-Latina protagonists in your comics and such, and that's something that we noticed as well, that both of these comics feature a Black feminist gesture where heroism and sacrifice are embodied by Black Puerto Rican women, right? And so, and that's something that we should also be aware of too, is how much is put on these women, the responsibility to sacrifice, right? Yeah. And we're curious to again, you said it was intentional to center them because we don't see their voices as often, but how is the, could you provide absolutely insights about the motivations behind your choices here and sort of absolutely. That impact of when we look at Black women, Afro-Latino women, Afro-Puerto Rican women, that putting all that weight on them, that weight of the world and the responsibility?
I come from a big family of Puerto Rican women. I grew up with mostly Puerto Rican women who are all my color, who are all dark skinned. And even now when I think about my cousins, they hold the weight of the world on their shoulders. I think about my cousins who they work hard to the point where I think they've sacrificed a lot for that work. I think they've sacrificed having families because they have been so involved in being leaders in their industry, that they haven't had time to really do for themselves. And that's to me, that's an emotional thing, and I think about it, it's something I don't want to think about too much, and then I start tearing up. And I think about, my grandmother. My grandmother had way too many kids, but at that time it's normal. I think I have like 6 aunts, 2 uncles, but there's a lot of weight in that. There's a lot of responsibility in trying to raise a child in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. The way the economy was, living in Spanish Harlem. I think there are a lot of women who do that now that don't get a lot of credit for it. I think you have women who almost become villainized, for just not wanting to have another kid. You know what I mean? Because it's hard. We get a lot of women get villainized because maybe they need to ask for government assistance because it's hard out there. People are not really paying a lot, and you can have 2 or 3 kids, which is okay and it's their choice. Where does that inner strength come from? Because I can tell you, having a 13-month-old and and taking care of him just for one day by myself, I cannot imagine how a mother can do that. A single mother can do that for 18 years. So there's a strength there that I don't think a lot of men have. And just sort of understanding that strength and putting that in a story in which, again, you have to save the world, or you have to stop everything you're doing to fly to Puerto Rico and look for your parents because you have no idea what happened to them.
So maybe this idea of like giving a space to these sacrifices that are happening anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Cool. All right. So, thank you so much for joining us. Those are like our core questions there. But before we wrap up, is there anything that you want to plug that you're working on or where our listeners can find you and your work? I met you at New York Comic-Con,
yeah.
So...
You mentioned the podcast, so maybe give
absolutely.
a shout out to your podcast people.
Absolutely. So I have a podcast that I'm starting now to get returned to because I had to take some time off since I had a child. It's called Black Comics Chat. We're on Twitch. We do our shows every Sunday, probably around 10 or 11, depending on who's up. But that's on Twitch. And what we do is that we basically look at old cartoons from a now perspective, meaning that we can look at cartoons from the 80s and maybe the early 90s, look at the Black characterizations or lack thereof, or Latino characterizations or lack thereof, and really kind of break it down. It can be funny. There at one point we used to watch Gem for at least a straight year. We watched all 3 seasons and talked about feminism, talked about the characterizations. It was a really good time. And then we will also talk about current events and comic books and stuff like that. So we kind of squeeze that all in about maybe a 90-minute show on Twitch. So, you can also find us on Instagram at Black Comics Chat. For me, you can find me on Instagram, X, or Twitter, however you call it, Latin Negro, one N, because I know people like to put 2 N's. And yeah, I also have a website called AnthonyOtero.com, which I have to update after I got contacted by you. I was like, there are things here that are like old links to my Huffington Post work and some stuff that I just need to update. But yes, so you can find me there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us. I know, like, asking you to talk about comics and then saying, oh, but here's the caveat. We also want to talk about climate and all of that.
Loved it.
I think it was a great way to connect those two and to show our listeners that, like, doing things that are centered around environmentalism and the climate crisis do not only exist in one form, that you can approach it through art forms like comics as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, Rojo. So that interview with Anthony, what did you think? What were your takeaways from that?
Yeah, I really enjoyed learning about how Anthony's family, especially the women, were a big inspiration to create his strong Afro-Boricua characters. His reflection on race, ethnic identity, and the military, again, were conceived through the perspective of family members and erased histories of Black Puerto Ricans in U.S. wars. Mm-hmm. Yeah, something that, as I briefly mentioned, when we were talking with him, resonates with my family. I think it was very important, his emphasis on storytelling as a political tool, especially to discuss the trauma of climate crisis in the Caribbean and extractivist economies. I also like how he pointed out self-publication as an avenue to take control of our stories and developing an archive of them.
Yeah, exactly. It's like if others aren't going to publish your work, then at least now there are avenues that you can get your stories out into the world. Mm. Yeah, for me, as a fellow comic nerd, I really appreciated the idea of having someone come and speak about environmentalism and the climate crisis through that perspective. It really just goes to show, like, how many ways and how many mediums with which you can critique the environmental destruction at the hands of human beings, especially those in power. I think Third World is a great example of that. His examples, not only from his own works, but also from some of the more mainstream fandoms that he's a part of, really drove home the idea that this is a problem that's frequently addressed in sci-fi and fantasy works, right? He talked about Star Wars, he talked about Star Trek, and many others. The two comics that he wrote are quite distinct from one another, but the fact that they both bring up environmental concerns, both in the present day and potential issues in the future, really speaks volumes. Personally, I would love to see Third World expanded out into a full graphic novel at some point.
Even a series. It will be interesting to see like a series of comics or
short comics.
An expansion of the world he created or the universes that he created, right?
Exactly. Yeah. As a short comic series, it'd be really cool to just kind of say oh, here's issue A, here's issue B, and kind of touch on each one individually and see how they all link together in this world that he's created.
I'm particularly interested in how the machinery of Third World works. Yeah.
Yes.
And he pointed at that he already designed that, so it was like, I'm really curious about those possibilities.
Bring it, give it to us. Yeah. No, it was great. That was, I think, a great way to start off our season on climate activism. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us for this episode. Remember, you can share your thoughts with us on social media or by email.
Yeah, always follow the podcast on social media, Instagram, X, at Latinx Visions. Our email address is still the same, latinxvisions@gmail.com. And we would love to include your thoughts in a future episode. So please write us.
Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Share us with your friends and family. Subscribe and leave a review to help others find the podcast. It really helps.
Estamos a la escucha, mi gente.
Dale. Until next time.